Hi everyone. Welcome back to my channel. Today, I will as always help you fall asleep with the best stories. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Enjoy listening. As a kid, most people would say that they had their favorite place to play either by themselves or with their friends. Mine just so happened to be very specific. It wasn't specific in the sense that a plethora of details had to fall into place just to make it perfect. It was more about the time of year where I'd be able to mingle amongst the high stalks and conceal myself from anything and everything around me. I'm talking, of course, about a cornfield. This was not your average wide-spanning flatland field that gets tilled at the same time every year. The big difference with this particular field was that for some odd reason, the farmer who owned the land only sowed the crop every other year. I never found out why, but it might have something to do with the tale I'm about to tell you. In those early days, I had a small group of friends who lived relatively close to me. During the summer, we would gallivant through the forests and across streams. We would relax by the lake and bike down the dirt road I lived on. But one day we noticed the cornfield for the first time ever. I'm not sure how we hadn't seen it prior, but now I chalk it up to our adolescent minds being far too distracted with the world around us to notice. But that day, my friends and I all became elated with the notion of running between the rows of corn that stretched higher than our imaginations. We would play various games like hide and seek, tag, and we would even knock down different sections and pretend they were our forts. Sorry, Mr. Beasley. That entire summer we let our minds run wild with the fantastical aura the field provided, and nobody ever told us what we were doing was wrong, or at least impolite. When the crop was harvested, my friends and I were incredibly disappointed, and two of them seemed completely deflated altogether, as if their whole world had been ripped away. I felt for them, I really did, because I, too, had a great sense of sorrow deep within my being for no longer having our place of respite. That school year was the most boring year I can remember. My friends and I drifted apart, and even for people our age there was a palpable tension growing amongst us that you should only find between estranged adults. Needless to say, we were all extremely unhappy. Winter came and went. Then spring, followed by summer. Believe me when I say, I was brimming with excitement over the prospect of returning to the cornfield. And, as summer approached, my friends and I reconnected and were all incredibly excited about delving back into our world away from home. However, when my mother told me she hadn't seen any corn growing in the field, I was heartbroken. I told my friends and they all didn't believe her, so of course we agreed to meet at my place and ride our bikes to see it with our own eyes. Much to my, and assuredly their, dismay, my mother was right. There wasn't any corn in the field this year. It was nothing but dirt with small vegetation sprouting from it. Once more we were devastated, and some of us began to wonder if we would ever be able to play in the corn ever again. Another boring year flew by, and as reality set in further, I started to lose interest in the cornfield. When I would bring it up to my friends, they seemed disinterested as well. It reached a point where we all agreed to just stop talking about it because we were older and therefore we didn't need childish games to pass the time anymore. As summer came and the first fields near me started showing signs of growth, I decided I would bike down alone and check out the corn just to satisfy my wondering mind. Upon coming around the row of trees that normally obscured the field, I saw it, in all its green glory. The field had returned, or rather, Mr. Beasley had planted it once again. My heart pounded with joy and excitement. I thought about my friends and if I should tell them about it, but something had a hold on my mind. It was like an exceedingly demanding force beckoned for my presence deep in the stalks. I found myself leaving my bike on the side of the road in favor of entering the field alone without a single rhyme or reason. It was the middle of the day and the sun was high in the sky, covering every far-reaching corner of the field with its nurturing light. But when you're in the corn, you can't see one row from the next, and sometimes the corn plays tricks on you. I thought that's what happened to me when I started seeing hints of movement rippling between the individual stalks. At first it seemed like my own eyes were betraying me because the moment I turned my head to focus on the movement, it was gone. But then I heard it again. There were hurried scurrying noises weaving in and throughout the field around me like a host of rats searching for carrion. Obviously as a kid, I was pretty scared. However, my friend Dorian suddenly emerged from out of nowhere and nearly made me piss myself. "Dorian, what are you doing out here?" I asked, quite perturbed and in the middle of trying to catch my breath. He smiled and flipped his curly brown hair. "The same thing you're doing out here," he said jovially. Immediately I felt remorse. "I'm sorry I didn't call and invite you and the rest of the guys out here. I just wasn't sure if the field would be around this year, and I didn't want to get anybody's hopes up." "Who cares about them?" said Dorian unexpectedly. "We can have plenty of fun with just the two of us." Something about his eyes didn't sit well with me. They looked hungry, but being as young as I was, I couldn't come to rational conclusions. "Are you sure? Won't they be mad if they find out we played without them?" I asked quietly. His eyes widened and he reached out and grabbed my wrist. "You can invite them tomorrow. Right now it's just me and you, and I want to show you something." "Show me something?" I wondered aloud as he began pulling me through the corn. Dorian dragged me for a long time without saying another word. I kept asking him where he was taking me, but he wouldn't answer. He just smiled, and it must have been wide because I could see his cheeks perk up every time he did. Eventually we came to a small clearing where the corn had been matted down. Dorian smiled again and pointed to a strange object protruding from the center of the circle. As I approached it, I realized it was a bone, although I have a hard time remembering which type these days. At that moment, however, I knew it shouldn't be sticking out of the ground like it was. "What's that?" I asked while inching my hand closer towards it. "Doesn't it look fantastic?" shouted Dorian in an inquisitive demeanor. "I put it there. Hopefully something incredible will happen." "You put it there? Where did you get it?" "I found it. Can you believe that?" He was incredibly excited, and I wasn't sure why, because to me, I felt uncomfortable standing next to it. "Where did you find it?" I asked as the tip of my finger touched it. "What even is it?" "It's a bone," he said as happy as could be. I reeled my hand back in disgust and fright. "A bone?" I shouted while trying not to freak out even more. "Yes. Doesn't it look delicious?" asked Dorian with that same uneasy hunger set deep within his stone-gray eyes. "Delicious? Why are you being so weird, Dorian? What's gotten into you?" "Oh, never mind. I just thought you'd like to see it. I think it's neat." He reached down to grab the top of the bone before twisting it around. "I think I'm going to go home," I said, scared out of my mind. "Okay. Hey, let's get everyone else out here tomorrow. But we should come at night. That way we can play some hide and seek like old times, but it'll be much more fun if it's in the dark." As I look back on it now, his face looked like what you might see on someone with psychopathic tendencies. I reluctantly agreed, even though Dorian's enthusiasm was unsettling. I don't remember how long it took for me to find my way out of the corn, but I know that by the time I reached the road where my bike was, it was dusk. As I rode home, I couldn't help but think about Dorian's malignant look and of how he was there in the first place. It was my understanding that he was helping his dad clean up their yard on that day, but I could have been mistaken. My mother scolded me when I returned home, wondering where I had been and all that. I told her about Dorian and the cornfield, and she gave me that typical motherly warning of, "You better be careful and mind that you don't get into trouble. I don't want to have to clean up after your mess if you anger Mr. Beasley by being in his field." "I will, Mama, I promise," I said in retreat, and in respect of my mother's wishes. That night I woke up in a cold sweat with my heart furiously beating. I wasn't having a nightmare, so I quickly scanned the room the best I could for a possible reason as to why I was awoken. Nothing caught my eye until I looked at my window. Dorian was standing there with his face pressed against the glass. I jumped and gasped before regaining my composure. Dorian's elated expression failed to wane even after noticing he had scared me. I crawled out of bed and went over to my window. I didn't open it. Instead, I opted for just talking through the glass since it was quiet enough. "What are you doing here, Dorian?" I asked lethargically. "Just came to remind you about getting everyone to the field tomorrow night." He was exaggeratedly excited. "Yeah, I'll call them in the morning. You should go home. I don't even know why you're out there right now." Dorian didn't respond. He simply nodded without taking his eyes off me before backing away from my window into the dark beyond the reach of my nightlight. Now I know that wasn't normal behavior, but as a young boy, I didn't know any better. The next morning I started by calling Ben. When I mentioned the previous day as well as the way Dorian had been acting, he was furious. However, I was able to calm him down by telling the truth. I didn't know the field would be there, and I surely didn't know Dorian would be there either. After that, he came to terms with the situation and agreed to sneak out that night. Next, I called Corbin, who wasn't angry nor excited, and strangely enough he agreed with me about Dorian's behavior. Luckily, I didn't need to convince him because he was already prepared to jump at my beck and call. It was nice not having to explain myself further to one of my friends. Finally, I called Dorian. I wanted to confirm that we were still in fact meeting in the field that night. But when he answered, he was completely confused. I mean, he was almost yelling at me saying, "I never left my house yesterday. And you're crazy, Gavin." I admit, he almost had me believing that everything I saw was entirely a figment of my imagination. Fortunately, he managed to collect himself and decided in favor of coming to the field as well, although it was his idea to begin with. My mother suspected something was up and continually pressed me for information all day long. I was able to dissuade her from asking me after dinner time because I was getting annoyed, and I'm sure she sensed it. Finally, night fell and I waited for my mom to go into her room. When I heard her door close, I grabbed the flashlight I kept under my pillow and snuck out of my window onto the soft grass outside. In the back of my mind, I was worried about whether my friends would actually come, and another part of me began to feel fear of being out in the dark alone. I was terrified of the dark as a kid. My bike was left out in the rain far too often, and therefore the chain grinded and squeaked from the rust that covered it as I pedaled down the dirt road towards the cornfield. On the way, I met up with Corbin. He had a flashlight attached to the front of his bike as well as a separate handheld one gripped tightly in his left hand. I rode up next to him, and he nearly lost control. It was hard for him to hold the flashlight while holding the handlebars at the same time. "Why'd you scare me like that?" he shouted as he darted his head in many directions. "I didn't mean to," I said softly. "It really wasn't my intention to spook him." "This is so stupid," he said after a short time. He must have been referring to our antics regarding our visit to the cornfield. I know, and Dorian acted like he had no idea what I was talking about when I called him. "He did?" Corbin asked, perplexed. "That's weird, right?" "Well, you did say he was already being weird. I wonder if he is trying to trick us or something. Maybe? The whole bone thing has me seriously wondering if there might be something wrong with him." "Bone thing? You didn't mention that this morning." "Yeah, he brought me to this spot in the field where a bone was sticking out of the ground. I'm not sure what kind it was, but he asked if I thought it was delicious." "What? That's so weird, Gavin. How are you not, freaking out over that?" "Well, I don't know. It's Dorian. Maybe he's just into some weird stuff these days." "You're telling me," he said before the conversation ceased entirely, and we continued riding until reaching the edge of the cornfield. Ben was sitting on his bike seat with a flashlight as well. I was glad everyone opted for bringing one since I had forgotten to mention it on the phone earlier. I looked around for Dorian but couldn't see him, so I asked Ben. Has Dorian already showed up or what? Nope, said Ben sharply. You haven't seen him? Not yet. Don't be mean, Ben. This wasn't Gavin's idea, said Corbin. I'm tired and I don't like mosquitoes. Neither do I. I said softly, how long have you been here? Ben shrugged, I don't know, like 4 hours? 4 hours? You're lying. I snapped. He chuckled, nah, I've only been here for a little bit. If you should be messing with anyone, it's Dorian, said Corbin as he scuffed his foot against the dirt. Well, he isn't here, is he? Asked Ben while turning his head away from us. Then, the sound of spokes clicking sounded off in the distance. That must be him, I said, shining my light down the road. Dorian rounded the corner from the other side of the tree line and came to a skidding halt in front of us. It's about time you showed up, said Ben perturbed. I don't know what you're all thinking, but I have no idea what Gavin's talking about. I only came down here to see what all the fuss is, said Dorian. Why are you lying to them, Dorian? We were both in the field yesterday. You even came to my window last night. I did not. I was sleeping the same as you, shouted Dorian. Corbin stepped off his bike and stood in the road between us. Enough, he began. It doesn't matter now. Let's just go in and see what happens. If Gavin is trying to mess with us, then we'll find out, and if Dorian is doing the same thing, then we'll find that out as well. Corbin was definitely the sensible type, even at the age of 11. Fine, let's go, said Ben hastily. He, too, stepped off his bike and gripped his flashlight in his left hand. This is so stupid, professed Dorian before throwing his bike against the ground and producing a small flashlight as well. Good, I'm sure this will be over before we know it, said Corbin as he shined his light towards the corn. I'm not making this up, I said under a muttered breath. I was quiet enough that nobody heard me. A breeze picked up as well and likely carried my hushed words away. I took out my flashlight and shined it where Corbin was shining his. Apart from the added horror of being dark, the field looked no different, and I still had a yearning sensation for it. Ben and Corbin went first and Dorian followed. I stayed behind because if Dorian was planning something, I didn't want to be the brunt of it. After walking between the tall green stalks for who knows how long, Dorian disappeared. I mean, 1 minute he was there and the next he completely vanished as if he became air itself. I stopped moving and shined my light in every direction searching for him. Ben and Corbin noticed that a distance had been created from me to them, and they stopped as well. Corbin shined his light at me and shouted, Hey! What's the matter? It's Dorian! He's gone. Gone? Asked Ben with a certain shakiness in his voice. Yeah, he was right in front of me and now he's just gone. They both walked to me and searched with their lights. Well, what do you mean he's gone? Like, did he run off somewhere? Asked Corbin quietly. No, I'm saying he was standing, or rather, walking right where you are and then he vanished. That's not possible, said Ben hurriedly. He always had a knack for pointing out the obvious nature of things. What's not possible? Asked Dorian as he stepped out of the corn behind me. His intrusion scared me to the point of hyperventilation, but I managed to maintain my composure. What the heck, Dorian? Where did you go? I asked furiously because I'd been scared. Dorian smiled like the way he had the day before and patted me on the shoulder. I didn't go anywhere. I've always been here. Gavin said you disappeared, remarked Ben. Well, sometimes the field can play tricks on your mind. Uttered Corbin. It was not a mind trick, I said timidly. I wasn't enjoying the feeling of being defeated and refuted at every turn. Oh well. Let's continue, shall we? Asked Dorian, seemingly unbothered. I guess, answered Ben, and Corbin agreed. I simply followed without saying a word. Further into the field we went. Dorian was acting incredibly strange. He would turn around often and stare right at me with his creepy smile like some kind of deranged lunatic. He would even march over the stalks without being fazed like they weren't there. Then he stopped walking. I have an idea, everyone, he announced. An idea? Asked Ben. He was a boy of few words. Yes. Let's play hide and seek, suggested Dorian with a scheming demeanor. Hide and seek out here? Questioned Corbin. I agree, maybe if it was during the day, but at night. Count me out, I said fearfully. Nonsense. It'll be fine and fun. I'll start as the seeker. You all get 10 minutes to run and hide. You can even turn off your flashlights when you find a spot, said Dorian with a wry smile and an off-putting chuckle. If it gets me out of here sooner, then sure, said Ben, who was already walking away from us. Wait, Ben, I said, eager to hide with someone so I wouldn't be alone. I'm hiding on my own. I don't want to be caught with all of you, said Corbin, walking the opposite direction. Oh, this is so exciting, began Dorian. I'll start counting now. 1, 2, 3. Dorian laid on the ground with his head buried in his hands and counted loudly. I could hear him counting from quite far away as Ben and I walked for a good while before deciding on a spot. We found an area where the corn grew around a rock. It wasn't huge, but neither were we, so it covered us completely. Ben broke the silence after we settled in for the long wait. I know what you mean now, he said quietly. Huh? Dorian is acting strange. Did you notice how his mood changed entirely? After you claimed he disappeared, I mean? I told you. Something isn't right, and I don't want to be a coward, but I'm scared. Me too, he said unexpectedly. At least we aren't like Corbin. Yeah, I wouldn't want to be by myself out here. Thank you for understanding, Ben. No problem. I really just want to get out of here. Honestly, I was thinking about just walking back to the road and leaving. Why don't we? I asked curiously. He sighed. You know I'm in the Scouts, right? Yeah, what's that got to do with anything? Well, you didn't notice, but the direction I walked was relatively back the way we came. And where's the road? He asked as he turned his head towards me. Despite it being night, I could see fear on his face. Maybe we haven't walked far enough, I suggested. No, Gavin. I'm following Scout's survival rules. The moment I set foot in this field, I began counting the time, and even if we went diagonally from our starting point, we should still have found the road. That's really why I'm scared. I had never heard him speak that much. Don't worry. Hopefully you've just made a mistake, I said reassuringly. It's not likely, he said matter-of-factly. Suddenly, the stalks rustled near us. It wasn't caused by the wind because no breeze accompanied the sound. The noise was definitely reminiscent of someone working their way through the field, and they were approaching our hiding spot. Ben clenched his fists, and I tried to stifle my breathing. Then, Corbin appeared and sat by us as if he didn't just scare us half to death. Corbin, what are you doing here? I asked with a harsh whisper. He smiled, not unlike Dorian, and said I was getting lonely where I was hiding and decided to come find you guys. How could you have found us all the way out here? Asked Ben scrutinizingly. Oh, it wasn't too hard, plus you two didn't go very far. Not very far? Asked Ben angrily. We walked for nearly half the time Dorian should have been counting. I just don't see how it's possible for you to be here, but whatever. Just be glad we're all together now, said Corbin. I felt uneasy sitting next to him suddenly. He seemed like a different person. Yeah, I guess. said Ben, returning to his concise wordplay. We sat quietly for a very long time. In fact, I started to get tired even though fear vastly outweighed my desire for slumber. Only the buzzing of annoying mosquitoes and Corbin's strangely excited breathing kept me awake. After not hearing any more movement, or even Dorian calling out the typical, "Ready or not, here I come," I grew even more on edge. At one point, I wondered if he had left and his entire plan was to trick us into sitting out here for the whole night. Ben nudged me with his elbow and broke my contemplation. "What?" I asked sharply. "I'm going to try finding the road again," he said while rising to his feet. "Oh, are we going to try and escape?" asked Corbin enthusiastically. "We just aren't going to play Dorian's stupid game. Right, Gavin?" Ben asked while looking down at me. "Right?" I said before getting up as well. "I'll be right behind you," said Corbin. He was acting just like Dorian had been, and it was freaking me out. We began following Ben, but Corbin brushed past me to walk beside him. They wove through the stalks in an odd fashion that made it difficult to keep my light fixed on them. Then, like before with Dorian, they both disappeared. I started to panic immediately. Guys, where did you go? Don't leave me out here alone. Please." I admit tears began to well up in my eyes. Hey, I was a kid and a scared one at that. I did the only thing I could think of. I kept walking. The field around me fluttered and rustled, and each new sound made my heart skip a beat. The longer I walked, the worse it got, and my entire body was dripping with sweat. Then Ben reappeared. He smiled widely in a way I'd never seen him do before, and my eyes widened with shock. "What's the matter?" he asked with equally widened eyes. "Where did you go? And where's Corbin?" I tried my best to hold back my tears. "Don't worry about him. He went far away to hide." "No! You're lying. You both disappeared like Dorian," I shouted back. "Come with me, Gavin. I'll get you out of here," he said as he stepped around me to walk the opposite direction we had been. "But that's the other way. I thought you knew where you were going, Ben. I must have made a mistake because the way out is over here," said Ben ecstatically. "Okay," I said in solemn retreat. Ben started to skip through the corn, and I did my best to keep up, but I tripped over something and fell on my face. I remember my cheek being scuffed and my nose hurting. I also remember shining my light on my hand to see it covered in blood, but it wasn't my blood. There was a puddle of it underneath me. It was wet and sticky, an oil-like viscosity. Naturally, I shrieked, and Ben turned around with a frightening expression on his face. Before I could ask what was happening, he leaned down and started licking my hand. I pulled away from him in shock and said, "What are you doing? Delicious, isn't it?" he asked with a blood-covered grin. "You're scaring me, Ben. What are you even saying?" He smiled and then took off running. I didn't know what to do. I sat there on the ground with a pool of blood next to me before the disembodied voice of Ben echoed through the field around me. "Come find me," he said like a careless whisper. I was so lost and confused. My first instinct was to run away, but that had already proven impossible. So instead I chose to pick up my flashlight and wander slowly through the field, hoping I could make it until the morning. In my mind, I hoped my mother hadn't found out I was gone, because she would have been so worried by now. My legs were like butter, and it took all the strength I had left just to keep myself standing. As I stumbled through the rows of corn, I started to hear horrible gnawing sounds like an animal feasting on a carcass. At the time, I didn't equate it to that, but now that I'm older, that's exactly what it was. Upon pushing my way through a row in front of me, I was met with something no kid should ever have to see. 3 bodies, each torn to shreds and devoured. Their intestines were scattered across the ground, and their blood was splattered against the wall of corn stalks surrounding them. Their faces were preserved, and it was clear by the vague glow of my flashlight that they were my friends. All of them, including Dorian. Each of them had looks of pure terror, as if they were killed just as they were about to scream. My horrific discovery concealed the true gravity of situation, because in the middle of the bodies was a fourth, one that was moving. I slowly shined my light directly on it to reveal Ben, a second Ben, the one I had been following. He was eating Corbin's leg and groaning with voracious pleasure, as if he were in ecstasy. He ripped at the flesh with his teeth and seemed completely unaware of my existence, despite him asking for me to find him. I almost passed out from the sight, because I've always had an aversion to seeing large quantities of blood, but luckily I managed to keep myself standing. Ben continued his feasting on my friends. I shouldn't even call him Ben anymore. It dined on my friends while I stood there watching. It was grotesque, morbid, and traumatizing. I then made the mistake of taking one agonizingly loud step backwards, which prompted it to abruptly stop eating. It spun its head around in an impossible 180 degrees direction and smiled with blood-stained teeth. "You found me," it said in a sinister tone. Its back shuddered and began to expand like some kind of twisted metamorphosis, and my instincts told me to run, even if there was nowhere to go. So I did. I sprinted away from it, all the while I heard terrible screaming and the voice of Ben yelling, "Come back! Share in my meal! Taste the flesh and become one with me!" I wouldn't listen. I just kept running without turning around to look. I could hear it trampling through the field behind me, but I would not let it overtake me. I couldn't let it eat me too. The night had been harrowing, and my childish mind did everything it could to rationalize what was happening, but it couldn't understand, no matter how hard I tried. I don't know how it was possible, but I found the road and my bike along with it, and without hesitation I jumped on and rode away, only looking back once to see Ben standing on the edge of the field waving happily. The moment I got home, I rushed inside and woke up my mother. She was pissed at first and didn't want to give me her ear for even 1 second, but she must have seen the look on my face and in turn begun to believe me. She called the police and told them my story. I don't think they believed me either, but they went and checked anyway. A half an hour later, an officer showed up at our door and demanded to talk to me. My mother sat in the room the entire time I was telling him what happened. He had a difficult time understanding, and he kept asking me if I was sure it wasn't an adult out there. Obviously, I thought I knew what I saw, so I stuck with my truth even if it did sound outlandish. The officer left my room when I was done and asked to speak with my mother outside. I put my ear to the door to eavesdrop and heard the officer say, "They found a clearing out there where 4 bodies were maimed beyond belief. 3 of them are children. The other is unidentifiable at the moment. I don't know what was out there, but your son is lucky to be alive." My mother stayed in my room with me that night, and she softly wept while I remained in shock. It took me a long time to overcome my fear of the dark, and an even longer time to come to terms with the death of my friends. To this day I still don't know what happened or what was in that field, and as far as I'm aware, the police have let the case go cold. Worse still, it was revealed that the 4th body found was that of the farm's owner, Mr. Beasley. But despite all that, I drove by the field the other day. I wasn't even thinking when I did, I just happened to take that road. Nobody even owns that land anymore, not since that accident. It's considered cursed ground now, but somehow the field was fully grown. Worse still, Dorian was standing at the edge of the field waving as I passed by. I pressed my foot to the floor and drove faster than I should have to get away from that damn field. If I could offer a warning to anyone, I would say to always be wary of biennial cornfields. The end. The next story? It stands in the corner. It's always there watching me. I never get a moment of solace, a moment to myself. Wherever I go, it comes too. Sometimes it's farther away, other times it's close enough to touch. It all depends on where the nearest corner is. For as long as I can remember, it has been with me. When I was young, I thought everyone had something just like it standing in their corners, always staring without emotion. But when I brought it up to my parents, they condemned me and exclaimed their displeasure with what I was saying. I think they thought I was crazy. Still, none of that changed a thing. It stood in the corner regardless. The tall, gangly figure with bright white eyes reminiscent of industrial light bulbs was always with me. Day or night, rain or shine, I once trapped it in a closet when I was around 6. I had opened the door to look for an old toy, and the thing appeared inside with its back pressed into the nearest corner of the small space. Without even thinking, I closed the door and immediately noticed its absence. I had actually trapped it. But I didn't understand, because I was so young, that if I opened the door again, it would no longer be trapped. Although, perhaps nobody could have guessed that outcome. With what I know now, it's clear my experience was exclusive. So, when I opened the door, it escaped and resumed its position in the corner next to my bed, its favorite spot. I remember trying to do it again, but it wouldn't enter the closet after that. I also remember trying to talk to it, but there was never a response. It would watch me do everything without so much as a twitch or reaction. I soon found that the only place I could be free of it was outside, but even then, it would be somewhere in some corner far out of my view but not any less present. I grew up with this thing throughout the years and became accustomed to it always being there. As I started to learn more about myself and the world, I began to wonder if I had something wrong with me. It is not normal to have a 7-foot-tall lanky black figure lurking in every close corner. That's when the drugs started. I won't go into too many details. But let's just say I wanted to do all I could to make this thing go away. The problem was, nothing made it go away. No amount of oblivion separated me from that abysmal nightmare. Believe me, I tried things I'm not proud of and nothing worked. So, I started therapy and managed to kick the bad habits. There was even a time I was admitted to a type of sanitarium. While the method of treatment, the location, and even the doctors would routinely change, the corner-dwelling freak show, was the one thing that remained constant. When I was eating, there it stood in the nearest corner. When I was sleeping, it was almost right next to me, and when I bathed, it was always there watching like a dark sentinel. And nobody understood. Nobody believed me. There wasn't a single person that thought it could be something more than a sickened delusion, and that wounded me deeply. How could I have been seeing something like this since the earliest I can remember? I figured there wasn't any possible way my tiny mind could have been broken so severely so young. Then again, some things you just can't predict or imagine. Eventually, with a lovely recommendation by one of my many doctors, I was released from the institution and sent on my way. The state took care of me after that because I was deemed unfit to function in the workplace. I wouldn't really say that, but the entity would be at any job or place I went. So you could say it was a distraction. I honestly wished I could have done something because being stuck at home just brought it closer to me. You know, even though it has always been with me, I never saw it move any part of its strange body. Not once. The only movement was from corner to corner, but its statue-like position stayed the same, that is, until recently. For the first time, since the beginning, I saw it move. Now, initially I thought I had imagined it, but all that changed when it made eye contact with me. Picture this: you're laying on your bed with a tall, frail-looking entity looking over you from the nearest corner of your room. Suddenly you turn your head out of curiosity, and the thing that has always stood still, for as long as you can remember, slowly turns its head. What happens next is too wide. Glowing eyes are staring directly at you. I nearly left my skin. I don't want to sound dramatic, but I fell backwards off the bed. After I scrambled to my feet, I noticed its eyes were still following me. At that moment, I questioned it. What? Now you want to engage with me? Now you want to show some sign of life? As you can expect, it didn't respond. and that's how I lived. For a while at least. To be honest, it wasn't much of a change. Was I more terrified than before? Yes, but I got used to it rather quickly. I tried to speak with it several times, and all it would do was watch me. I started to mess with it too by making its head go up and down, and every which way as fast as I could. It gave me a little chuckle and lightened the whole situation. But then, I made a mistake. While I was once again laying in bed, I just couldn't shake this anger I had inside of me. Just seeing it in the corner of my eye really pissed me off. Its stare was reminiscent of a begging animal, and that unnerved me while also fostering this deep rage within my being. To add insult to injury, I was snacking on something. So I turned and asked, "Do you want something? You're always staring at me, you must want some, right?" By now, I felt insane. Who wouldn't? I knew it wouldn't respond. I still don't know why I asked. However, I then acted on a very radical impulse and attempted to hand what I was eating to it. And in less than a second, my wrist was shattered. I didn't even see it move, and for a short time, I didn't know I was injured. Soon, however, the warmth grew and the burning, stinging, and immensely throbbing pain set in. I began to yell while holding my wrist with my free hand. The thing continued to stare with its beady, bright eyes fixed on mine. It wouldn't even blink. I called an ambulance and waited by the front door. It took a position in the corner of the living room, which was the one nearest to me. I wouldn't take my eyes off it until the paramedics arrived, and when they did, I told them I tripped and landed on my hand. I could tell they were skeptical, but it was more important that I get it treated, and since it was only me there, according to them, they didn't consider foul play. If only I could have told them that the culprit was hunched over in the tight corner of the ambulance the entire time. If only I could have told the doctor that the horrifying thing standing in the emergency room was the reason my wrist needed full reconstructive surgery. If only I knew what it wanted. After some intense physical exercise instructions, I was sent home. My wrist would be in perpetual stasis for several months, and the pain was excruciating, especially at night. I cursed at the thing in the corner whenever I couldn't sleep, but it had no effect. How could something have so little remorse for having committed such a horrible act? I suppose when you look at humanity. It's easy to see the irony in that question. Anyway, life really sucked for those long months. More than usual, I mean. I slowly rearranged my room. The bed was exceedingly difficult with a bum wrist, so that none of my furniture was near a corner. With my bed against the middle of the wall, I felt somewhat safe. I'll tell you this though, it is so hard to sleep when an entity capable of shattering your bones in one swift motion is constantly standing in a corner of your room. I wondered if it would do more after that incident, like would it start talking to me? Or would it suddenly cast away its corner perpetuity for a little more intimate closeness? I hoped not. Like I said, those months were long and strenuous. I asked if its neck hurt from always having it turned towards me so sharply, to no avail. What was I supposed to do? I tried poking it with a wooden dowel and nothing happened. It just kept those ridiculously large ocular bulbs fixed on me. But when I asked the most pertinent question, "Why me?" I actually got a response. Not the kind I hoped for, but it was something. After posing the question, it twitched subtly. It could have been my imagination, but trust me, I've lived with this thing my entire life, and believe me, it moved. I almost smiled. Not because the horror in the corner responded to my query, but because its movement meant it was listening. Which meant it was intelligent enough to be able to understand my dialogue. I brought all this up to my therapist, and, well, let's just say they were less than enthusiastic about the whole situation. You see, to them this was simply another case of either paranoid psychosis or some form of schizophrenia. I honestly can't blame them for thinking that, because no amount of scientific discovery could back up my claims. Hell, people online would believe me. But that hardly affected the outcome of my sessions. Pills, pills, and more pills. That was the solution to my unfortunate circumstance. None of them worked, of course. Over the span of the next week and a half, I began to notice new and strange things happening to the entity. For one, hair, it had begun growing brownish wavy hair from its veined black skull. First a strand, then several locks, and soon it had a full head of hair. That took about 4 days, and none of it made sense. On the 5th day, and for the first time ever, I awoke to it facing away from me. I nearly died from laughter. I was so elated. But my joyous celebration was quickly snuffed out when I noticed small, white protrusions coming from its back. Anyone could tell it was bone, and my happiness crumbled once again into fear. What was happening to it? The 6th day, or rather, night, was another instance of things taking a turn for the worse. I still had a rather annoying wrist cast at this time, and was having some of my usual uncomfortable sleep because of it. After having fallen asleep, I dreamt of heavy shadows pressing the life out of me with darkened hands orchestrated by evil incarnate. It was kind of fucked up, I'll say that. But hey, I was kind of fucked up too. However, when I was suddenly jolted awake, I realized that my dream was more of a nightmarish premonition. Because, angled over me like a four-legged spider, was it the entity? The whites of its giant eyes pierced my soul, and it felt like I had caught it in the act of something. Seeing it lording over my slumbering body paralyzed me. I tried to slow my breathing and keep it quiet, but the thing just stared at me as it always had. I then made another mistake. I tried to push it off of me. However, it didn't break my limbs, which I half expected to happen. Instead, it ripped off every single one of my nails, and once it was done, it returned to the corner and resumed its vigil. I screamed like you've never heard a man scream before, and if I remember correctly, I pretty much blew out my vocal cords. I didn't end up going to the hospital for that because, quite frankly, I figured they'd assume I did it to myself. Everything I was experiencing could have been chalked up to some sort of mental illness, and I really didn't want to go back to an institution. So instead, I bandaged all of my fingers and toes the best I could. Now my floor, bed, and even the walls going to the bathroom were smeared in blood. Unfortunately, I didn't have anything strong enough to clean the stained carpets, so for a couple weeks it looked like a murder scene in my home. But things didn't end there. See, there wasn't any one feasible thing I could think of to solve this rather unpleasant conundrum of mine. As I explained, I couldn't touch it. I didn't want to go anywhere near it, and I tried to maintain at least a 10-foot distance at all times. However, after waking up and seeing it spread over me like that, I realized that what I wanted was far different than what Iggy wanted. To add to all the confusion and terror, I came to the conclusion that it was going through a kind of metamorphosis. That was the only thing I could think of that would explain the changes it was going through. The hair, the bones, and now the nails. Long, sharp claw-like nails on both its hands and its feet. It made me wonder if somehow it stole mine. That's nonsense, I thought to myself. I also thought that maybe I was imagining these changes in order to somehow increase the severity of its appearance in my mind. Why would I do that, you might ask? I don't know. Why does anyone do anything? If I really was mentally ill, then that could explain mostly everything. But then that would beg the question of just how messed up was my mind that nothing could fix it. Cut to 3 months ago, when another new development occurred. By that time, I had accepted my malevolent lifelong companion's changes and adapted the best I could. I kept my bed where it was in the room, but started leaving the light on when I slept. It seemed to help because I hadn't woken up to the entity above me since the first time it happened. And for all intents and purposes, I felt like things had returned to a relative normality. Well, as normal as my state of living could get. That's when it spoke. It spoke with a voice that sounded like many. At first. Then, it lowered in pitch before jumping to one so high I had to cover my ears. When I looked at it, it was covering its ears as well, as if it was copying me. That was very unsettling. Finally, its voice came back down to a tolerable level and it stopped speaking altogether. But only for a few deafening seconds. The next time it spoke, it was with my voice. It said, "Do you want something? You're always staring at me, you must want some, right?" Just as I had said to it once before, although it didn't make much sense as I was eating something when I had originally posed the question. I was far too disturbed to make that connection at the time though, and simply continued to stare at it. When I took my hands away from my ears, so did it, and as I began to slowly rise from my bed, it began to move as well. But it wouldn't leave the corner, so its movements were awkward and nonsensical. Then, it spoke again. This time it asked, "Why me?" I couldn't tell where it was speaking from as it didn't appear to have any sort of mouth, but hearing my voice coming from that horrid thing seriously made my skin crawl. I made a disgusted face and walked out of my bedroom. It reappeared in the corner of the hallway and I was forced to adeptly dodge away from it. As I walked through my house, the entity continued to move from corner to corner. It stopped speaking, but I noticed it had taken up copying my walking mannerisms. It would march in place as if it was mocking me. Terrified and confused, I decided to sit in the living room and try to avoid eye contact with the thing. It remained in the corner to the left of my TV and kept a solid gaze directly on me. "What do you want, creep?" I asked harshly. It stared at me. That much I know because I could still see it in the corner of my eye. But as far as I'm aware, it didn't have a reaction. I turned the TV on and cranked up the volume in an attempt to mentally escape my current reality. And then, it rushed at me. I barely had enough time to yell as immense fright filled my body. In a matter of seconds, it had reached me and it hurled my chair over with me still sitting in it. I fell out of the chair while it soared across the living room and hit the floor hard enough to knock the wind out of me. While I gasped for breath, the thing attacked the TV. It completely destroyed it, smashed it into a crumpled pile of plastic components, glass and metal. After I had regained my composure, it stood in the center of the room and watched me. I didn't move. I only watched back, and the silence in the room grew by the minute. Eventually, it slowly receded back into the corner, never once taking its eyes off me. It was then that I realized its eyes had begun to change, much like the rest of its body. They were becoming human-like and, strangely enough, were the same color as mine. I sat right there on the floor for the rest of the night. When morning came and the sunlight was peeking through the windows, I fell asleep. When I awoke, I felt a burning sensation all over my body. It was like I had been roasted on an open flame. I lifted my shirt up to reveal several patches of missing skin on my stomach and chest. And just as I was beginning to wonder about what happened, I saw the thing. Like always, it was in the corner, but now with various patches of skin on different parts of its body. The more I looked, the more terrifying it became. The skin was spreading. Each patch was slowly creeping towards another, yearning for a connection. I backed against the wall and shuddered without so much as an inkling of what to do. The entity hunched over, much to my surprise, before curling up into a ball on the floor. "Now's my chance," I thought, and I got up to grab a knife from the kitchen. Upon approach, I could hear it breathing, which was something I hadn't heard before in my whole life. Its body rose and fell with each strained breath, but that didn't stop me from attempting to plunge the knife directly into its head. Things couldn't ever be that easy. The knife bent on contact, and the blade nearly cut my hand. The entity had no reaction, and after my failure, I decided to leave. Where I would go, I hadn't the faintest idea. I just wanted to be away, or rather, out of my home while that thing did whatever it was doing. So I left. I drove to a park close by and took a walk. It was calming, but no amount of strolling got my mind off the danger in my home. Besides, I couldn't stay out all night long. After a few disgruntled looks from other people at the park, I went back home. There was a terrible sense of heaviness in the air, like the darkness beyond my door harbored pure hatred towards me. I knew that thing would be in there, and you'd think I'd be used to it by now, given it had always been with me, but the things that had been happening to it recently were concerning. But I was delighted to find that upon entering my home, it was gone, freedom at last. My life and my home, no longer plagued by that thing. But after cleaning and going to sleep, I came to find that I was farther away from freedom than I could have possibly imagined. A scream came from outside somewhere, and it shocked me awake. I jumped out of bed and stood in the center of my dark room for a few minutes trying to gather my thoughts. I had covered the windows with black curtains and was delighted to still be without the entity in the corner once they were taken down. When I looked outside, I noticed a small crowd had gathered near my lawn. I was given a home in a sort of community cul-de-sac where most people have access to some of the facilities nearby. A laundromat, for starters. But there was also a small gathering area with 3 benches, a water fountain, and a bird bath in the middle of the cul-de-sac. However, the reason for the commotion was far more sinister than I could ever have imagined. After throwing some clothes on, I went to see what was happening. I took a few steps off the porch and noticed they were huddling near the bird bath. 2 women were standing with their hands over their mouths, and there were several other people pointing towards the bath. I overheard some of the conversation between the 2 women as I got closer, and it sounded like they were saying, "Who would do this?" and "Only someone who's sick in the head." As I reached the grassy edge of the gathering area, a man stopped me and said, "Be careful, it's a real mess over there." "Why, what happened?" I asked while trying to look past him. He sighed and crossed his arms. "Morbid shit, that's what. Am I not allowed to see?" "Oh, by all means. I was just trying to prevent your day from being ruined. I appreciate it, but the screaming woke me up so you could consider it already ruined." The man chuckled. "Yeah, well, I suppose you'll have to let that scene over there." He gestured with his head. "Determine whether your day goes from bad to worse." I nodded and walked past him. It isn't often that so many people are gathered here, so whatever it was must have been awful. Awful was an understatement. As the bird bath came into view, the first thing I noticed was red. A lot of red. There was blood in the bird bath, both splattered on the stone it was made of and mixed with the water. Moreover, I counted at least 5 birds whose bodies were completely mangled beyond recognition. Some were even turned inside out. I felt my stomach lurch for one quick moment before settling again. I didn't want to dry heave in front of everyone, so I managed to suppress the urge. The 2 women who were covering their mouths backed away, and I turned to face them. "Does anyone know what happened?" I asked while pointing towards the bird bath with my thumb. One of them shook her head. "No, nobody has any idea. My husband noticed it from our bedroom window, and we both came to investigate. It's just horrible." The other woman nodded her head in agreement. "Nobody saw anything? It's one thing to somehow manage to catch a single bird and kill it, it's another thing to catch and kill 5. Also, they don't seem to have been shot, so we can rule out target practice. If anyone has seen anything," began the woman. "They haven't come forward. Besides, animal control is on its way to investigate. So I suppose they will give us their best possible answer." I muttered, "Sure, what was that?" She asked curiously. "Oh, nothing. Hey, if you find anything important out, could you let me know? If there is anything to know, then I'm sure the property management will bring it to the attention of everyone." I thought about how the woman didn't need to be so rude to me, but at the same time, I figured she was a little shook up. I ended up nodding and walking off back to my house. Slowly but surely the crowd began to disperse, and I watched animal control come and go from my bedroom window. Judging by the way it looked, they seemed just as confused as everyone else. As expected. Nobody ever came to my door to inform me, and I suppose it was better that way. I didn't associate with anyone, let alone the people who lived next to me, so all things were as they should be. Except for one thing. Where was the shadow? The following week, I was awoken several times by various screams, emergency sirens, and flashing lights. Each time the police would knock on my door and ask if I knew anything about this or that. Apparently, by word of the officers, a serial murderer was wreaking havoc in our cul-de-sac. 3 of my neighbors had been found dead by way of profound dismemberment, and even more gruesome ends. That's the way one officer put it. I felt terrible telling them that I knew nothing about what was happening. In reality, I had a feeling about the cause of this chaos, but I didn't think anyone would believe me. It had to be the shadow thing, or whatever you want it to be called. But why? What would it have to gain from slaughtering both birds and people? Unfortunately, I didn't have to wait long for an answer. By the time the end of the week came, over 10 people had been targeted and killed in my quaint neighborhood. I was heavily advised to leave my home until the authorities caught whoever was doing the killings, but I knew they never would. I didn't have anywhere else I could go anyway, so I stayed. I think a couple others stayed as well, but none of that matters now. After midnight yesterday, I no longer know who I am. I was just getting to bed and was closing my eyes when a flash of lightning outside lit up my room. The light illuminated a twisted figure standing in the corner of my room with their head facing down. My whole body stiffened and I pulled the blanket up to help stifle my breathing. Then, the figure lifted its head and said, "Why me?" I knew then that it was the entity, and it had come to kill me. I sprung out of bed and rushed for the door. From the corner of my eye, and in the corner of my room, I could see the figure slowly start walking towards me. I had no interest in communicating with it or finding out what it wanted. I didn't care anymore. It started to rain outside as I stumbled through my house to the front door. Heavy footsteps were approaching, and it felt like one of those dreams where no matter how fast you run, the thing chasing you is always right there. When I did reach the door, I took a glance down the hallway to my room. It stood at the end of the hall under darkness, and only the flash of the lightning outside would allow me to see any of its features. But I feared that if I stared too long or waited even a second more than I needed to, it would kill me. So I opened the door and ran outside. I was in nothing but my underwear and left standing in the pouring down, cold rain. The door to my home slammed shut and I was confused. Why would it close the door? Suddenly, a light came on inside. What the fuck is going on? I thought. The silhouette of a person appeared on the other side of the living room curtains. Slowly the curtains drew back and what I saw has me questioning my entire existence. It was me. I was standing in the living room window. From there things are hard to remember. Everything about me is fading away, even my skin is turning black like the void. But there is one final thing that has stayed in my mind since seeing that copy of me. I think it said something, mouthed it rather, and I'm fairly certain it said, "I wanted you." The end. The next story? I didn't want to be one of those idiots who can't follow rules. I'm a no-sleep addict. Especially these days, with nothing else to fill my time, I spend endless hours scouring new, and then the archives, for stories that I haven't yet read. My favorite are rules stories. You probably know the kind. I'm a night shift guard at an abandoned mall, and someone left me a strange list of rules. The OP never takes the rules seriously at first. Inevitably something creepy happens, and they panic and break one. I always thought that it would be so simple for me to follow the rules, by just keeping a clear head. My chance to prove myself came unexpectedly. "Hey, you still looking for a job?" Tony, my roommate, asked me over dinner one night. "Uncle Mike is looking for an overnight warehouse manager." I hurried to chew and swallow a huge mouthful of spaghetti. "I don't have any management experience," I said. Tony waved his fork dismissively. The title's just for show. All you'd be doing is keeping an eye on the warehouse, make sure no one breaks in and stuff. What's the pay? $25 an hour. I choked on a piece of onion. As I took a gulp of water, massaging my throat, it occurred to me that Tony was doing me a favor. We'd gotten close over 2 years of living together, and he knew that I needed money in a bad way. Where do I sign up? I joked. The next day, an Uber dropped me off at 9 p.m. sharp at the warehouse address. The warehouse was an ugly concrete building nestled between a junkyard and a shuttered dentist's office. I knew it was a dentist's office because of the rotted wood sign over the door, which read Happy Teeth, next to a chipped picture of a cartoon emoji grinning widely with a full set of realistic human teeth. I pulled open the warehouse's thick metal door and stepped inside. I found myself in a huge, mostly empty room, illuminated by strips of flickering fluorescent lights. A few wooden crates were stacked haphazardly against the far wall, next to another metal door. To my left was a small closet whose door was slightly ajar. To my right, a wooden desk with a chair behind it. On the desk lay a silvery key and a sheet of printer paper. My heart began to beat faster as I picked up the paper and read the following in large black print: Rules. Lock the door behind you when you enter the building, and again when you leave. Do not open the door for anyone. If they are meant to be here, they will have a key. Do not go into the back room, especially if you hear voices coming from it. Ignore any unusual smells. Never open the crates. If they leak, there is a mop in the janitor's closet. If you see a man in a blue and white striped suit, be polite to him, but do not look at his face. Do not call the police. They are not on your side. Do not talk to anyone who looks like a police officer. They are not on your side. Was this a prank? I tried to recall if I'd mentioned my obsession with rules stories to Tony before. After a moment, I decided that, prank or not, I'd do what I'd wished so many times the OPs of those stories would do. Keep a clear head. Follow the rules. I took the key and locked the heavy metal door behind me. Then I peeked into the closet, discovering that the cramped space doubled as both a janitor's closet and a restroom, containing a urinal, sink, mop, and bucket. Finally, I sat down at the desk, pulled out my phone, and started scrolling Reddit. I was proud of myself for having avoided the obvious trap. If I had gone to scope out the back room, no doubt something would have enticed me to open the door. No, better to stay right here. Several hours of doom scrolling later, I was sitting in my chair, half dozing, when a rattling sound startled me awake. I checked my phone 1 a.m. I heard the rattling again, coming from the front door. Someone was trying the door handle. I held my breath, staring at the jiggling handle. It occurred to me that there were no windows in the entire warehouse. No one could see in, and I couldn't see out. After a few seconds, the door handle stilled. Boom! The entire door shook, as if someone or something had struck it with tremendous force. My heart jackhammering in my throat, I stood up and slowly backed away. Boom! 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 My back hit something cold. I was pressed against the back wall. As if a switch had flipped, everything fell still and quiet again. Under my hand, I felt the rugged metal of the door to the back room. Had the sole purpose of the assault by the entity outside been to drive me toward this room? In the sudden silence, I heard something through the wall. It was faint but high-pitched, nibbling just at the edges of my hearing, swelling in volume before dying away again, over and over in an irregular pattern. It sounded like a crying baby. I fled back to my desk, my mind whirring. Could there really be a child trapped back there? Should I call the cops? At that last thought, I snapped back to my senses. My eyes went to the printout on my desk. Do not call the police. I shook my head, smiling at the implausibility of the scenario. A baby in the back room of an industrial warehouse. I needed to keep my wits about me. Nothing else strange happened for the rest of the night. I used part of my first paycheck to buy a pair of noise-canceling headphones and showed up for my second shift with them already over my ears. The noise cancellation on max. I froze as I stepped through the warehouse door. The air smelled wrong. It was coppery, like an old penny, with an unpleasant undertone that reminded me of a sewer leak, a mix of filth and decay. Coughing, I turned and locked the door. As I turned back around, something caught my eye. The crates at the back of the warehouse were sitting in what looked like a pool of tar. Swallowing down a vague feeling of unease, I went to fetch the mop. The tar-colored substance, when I mopped it up, was gloopy like day-old gravy. The coppery smell floated around me, so strong that it almost felt like a physical thing, a mist that saturated my nostrils, my clothes, my lungs with every shallow breath I drew. Something touched the back of my head, and my headphones slid off. I spun around, sloshing dirty water everywhere. A man stood a few feet away with my headphones in his hand. He wore a gaudy suit, with cream white and baby blue stripes. A gold bow tie sat crooked against the stiff white collar, and his face I dropped my gaze to the floor, trying to forget my brief impression of his glittering eyes and pale lips. His voice was soft and thin. "Are you the new overnight manager?" he asked. Yes, sir," I forced out. "No headphones," he said. "Stay alert." I bobbed my head like a fool while staring intently at his shiny brown shoes. "Keep up the good work," he said. The shoes shifted, and his clicking footsteps crossed the room, followed by the sound of the front door unlocking. Once I heard the door lock slide back into place, I dared to look up. The warehouse was empty. I quickly finished mopping up the mess by the crates. My headphones were sitting on my desk. I sank into my chair, staring at the round black pads that soaked up the dim light. Had the man come in from outside? Or had he been in the back room? My imagination, running wild, conjured a vision of him standing unnaturally still in the dark, on the other side of the wall. Why had he been there? How long had he been waiting? What if he wasn't the only one? I couldn't calm down. I played on my phone, paced the floor, tried to nap, but no matter what I did, it felt like 1,000 glittering eyes were boring into my back. I needed to see what was in the back room. I read and reread the rules. Do not go into the back room, especially if you hear voices coming from it. I wouldn't go in, I reasoned. I'd listen for voices, then open the door and take a peek. Just a peek, to make sure I was alone. I apprehensively approached the back door, noting how solid it looked, how thick the hinges were. I pressed my ear to the cool metal and closed my eyes. I was greeted by silence, broken only by my shaky breathing. Before I could lose my nerve, I yanked the door open. On the other side was a completely bare concrete room, lit by a naked light bulb dangling from the ceiling. I stared and stared, embarrassment and relief alternately washing over me in waves. Boom! I whipped around. Boom! The front door shook with the force of an unseen impact. "Police!" a voice shouted from outside. Boom! My eyes dipped to the sheet of rules. "They are not on your side. Police, open up!" Boom! The inked words swam in my vision. "Do not talk to anyone who looks like a police officer. They are not on your side." My vision exploded with golden stars. The next thing I remember is waking up in a hospital bed and being informed by a stern-faced policewoman that I was under arrest. I was too out of it at the time to follow much of what she said, but I pieced the facts together over the course of my ensuing trial. I had been unwittingly recruited by a criminal organization. The police had been after the big boss, the man in the blue and white suit, when they blew the door to the warehouse with me inside. One of the jury members threw up at the photos of what was found in those crates. No one believed my protestations of innocence. I couldn't explain why I had ignored the crying, mopped up the blood. Why I couldn't describe the appearance of the man in the suit despite having been close enough to touch him. I got 40 years without parole. My life is over, but let me leave you with this warning, in case I might save yours. If you find a strange set of rules, don't follow them. The end. The next story. I am the sole remaining employee of an abandoned water park. The summer I got a job here I was 17, and it was a good year. Ellen Ditsworth used to work the hot dog stand, and we'd sneak cigarettes under the beams of the Dragon Slayer ride, cringing and giggling as the cars went overhead, dripping water all over us. Wet hands and damp cigarettes. But it was near her station, and I think she found it funny to get splashed. It was out of the way, too. It was always quiet and cool down there, even in the summer heat. If any of the ride-goers smelled our cigarette smoke as they hurtled overhead, they didn't say anything. One time, when we fumbled around and flirted, I kissed her fingers and they smelled like an ashtray. I still think about it to this day. I was 22 when they offered me the winter job. Ellen was long gone by then. No more bright red short shorts and poorly shaven legs that she'd invite me to stroke under the pretense of showing just how bad she was with a razor. There were other girls, but by the time the final summer rolled around I'd long felt uncomfortable hanging out with new hires. Sometimes I'd stand there listening to them talk and I'd feel lonelier than I had when I was by myself. I was thinking about my future around this time when the manager told me he had an opportunity for me to make good cash. They needed someone to stick around and keep the place ticking while everyone went back to the real world. Usual guy had walked, and they needed someone bad. Last day before the park shut for winter was always Halloween, and that was only because it had a fireworks show. After that it turned into a ghost town, and I'd be on my own. I'd get a trailer to sleep in, and I could use my own car to get to the closest shop. The park would pay some of my gas. Not all of it, but enough to help out. Only real problem was I'd be alone. Not that the place was a desert island. There were 2 towns within easy driving distance, and I could have friends around so long as we didn't mess with the rides. But other than that, I'd be the only staff member on hand for the entire 4 months. Security guard and janitor rolled into one. I agreed, but I told him when the park reopened in March I'd be done. I figured it was time to move on. Get a degree like some of my friends had. Or maybe my dad could help me out with a job somewhere. World was wide open to me and I figured I'd sit on my ass all winter, make a shit ton on overtime, and then go on to some new adventure where I'd meet another Ellen Ditsworth or 2. Yesterday I turned 38, and I'm still in the park. Government signs my checks now. Couldn't tell you when that happened exactly. Probably after the media got wind of Denise Surrey, who broke in with her friends and never left. Lot of kids have gone missing here over the years, but she was the one who went mainstream. Her parents were doctors and she had blue eyes, so she got just enough attention to get the news cameras out. When the fuss died and the media moved on to its next story, some government guys came and installed 8-foot steel palisade fences. Gave me the keys to the only gate and scarpered real quick. Gave me a funny feeling seeing 4 men in suits, barrel-chested with pistols on their hips, climb into an unmarked vehicle and accelerate out the parking lot so fast the back of the car fishtailed. One of them looked over his shoulder at the park and he was so scared it was like he was looking at a mushroom cloud. I was the one who found Denise. She'd gone crawling head first down the astromissile water slide. One of those up and down kind of slides that have you bouncing along on a padded dinghy. Rides like that are usually open top, but this had long sections in a closed tunnel with LED lights to look like stars. Thing is, depending on weight, some people would catch air and hit the top of those tunnels going 20 mph, maybe more. We used to take turns going in there to pull out any teeth that had got stuck in the roof. 15 years later and that tunnel mouth looked like something out of a nightmare. Fairy moss covering the opening. Darkness inside heavier than the night around it. bone dry and with no obvious way to safety. Denise died of thirst. They think she was in there for 6 days, crawling around in the pitch black looking for an exit that should never have been more than 100 feet away. There were signs something was wrong with this place back when it was still open. I just didn't register them. There were the injuries and accidents that are common in every water park, but we had a couple hundred serious ones every year. Usually one a day. Tried to mitigate it with safety measures, but half the time they didn't work. Radios would bug out when you try sending a warning. Repair guys would get lost, calling up angry saying the road just kept going right forever and they'd had enough of this shit. Out of order signs would go missing. Sometimes kids would insist some staff member had waved them through on a closed attraction. They'd be so adamant I started to believe them. I think the manager did too. He made it policy to have name tags on us at all times. And if the kids said whoever gave them the go-ahead didn't have one on, he'd tell us all to forget it. Like it wasn't even worth trying to figure out who needed a disciplinary. I had it happen once where I radioed to the guy at the top of one slide and told him to stop any kids coming down. The last one had come out bleeding and looking unresponsive, and I wanted to check on him. I remember pulling him out of the water and looking at this boy all slack and pale as a sheet of paper with blue lips, so fucking cold it hurt just to hold him, and I wondered if I was holding someone dead when out of nowhere another kid slammed into me so hard I went under. Scared me shitless cause for a second or two. It was like I couldn't see the surface of the pool. Almost like there wasn't one. Just blue forever and ever. Before I could start to panic, my feet found the floor and I surfaced only to see the kid I'd been holding seconds ago standing there looking worried. He was the picture of good health. Asked if I was okay, said sorry for hitting me when he came out the slide, but really it was my own dumb ass fault for standing there in the first place. Guy at the top swore on his life he'd never got any radio message from me. I put it all down to the head injury, which was bad enough the owner made someone drive me to the emergency room. Looking back, I'm pretty sure it was the park having its fun with me. Could have been worse. You could say it likes to play tricks, but those tricks are mean as hell and over the years they've only got worse. Despite all I've told you so far, the first winter alone wasn't as bad as you might think. Creepy as hell walking around all those rides that were usually so busy and full of life. Tarpaulins pulled across all those pools, big and small, moving with gentle susurrations in the icy winds. It wasn't great in the day, overcast and dreary, the air seemingly blue. But at night it was even worse. I made those rounds quickly, stopping sometimes to summon what little bravery I had to shine a light in the pitch-black toilets, or to check one of the changing stalls dotted around the place. Things went missing a lot. Moved around. Once one of the rides came to life at 3 a.m. and I woke to the sound of tinny music echoing throughout the park. But winter came and went without any real incident. First day the park reopened, I went to see the manager and slipped in some water. Broke my left arm and did a number on my back. Owner was so scared of being sued he threw money at me. Told me he'd cover the medical bills and sit me up in my trailer and pay me to do nothing. Nothing. What was I gonna do? I'd arranged to start another job on a construction site in a few weeks, and there was no hope of me doing that kind of work with my injuries. I needed money and had no other way of making it. I agreed to stick around until I felt better, but unfortunately I never felt better. Winter soon rolled around again, and the same deal as last time was back on the table. He needed someone on site, and I needed money. I took it thinking another few months in the park wasn't so bad. I was wrong. Second time round was a lot worse. Part of it was me. 23 years old and with a bad back, drinking most nights and struggling with the prescription painkillers. Spent most days haunted by the strange feeling that my life's honeymoon phase was over. Hardly any friends accepted my invite to come spend a couple weeks, and those that did weren't around long. Couldn't tell you if that was just us growing apart, as friends often do, or the park's strange influence. Dave came round with his girlfriend for a couple nights. She grouched the whole time. Hated sleeping in the trailer while I stayed in a tent outside. But she hated the park too. Said she felt watched all the time. Trip was cut short when we found her screaming one morning. She was pointing at one of the slides saying something had come out of it, and was in the pool swimming around. But when we looked we didn't see nothing. She did have a hell of a bite on her ankle though. Funny shape to it. Dave looked at it and got real freaked out. They left in a hurry. Another car's tires screeching as it hauled us out of here at top speeds. Never did figure out what happened, but if she didn't like the park, well, I guess it didn't like her either, not that I was much safer. Found myself getting cut up like crazy doing basic odd jobs. Things broke all the time, even if they'd been fine for years and years. And then one night I came into my trailer to find a drowned possum on the little kitchen table. Poor thing was soaked in chlorine water that dripped onto the floor in a puddle. No marks going to or from it, like it just appeared there out of thin air. It stank like hell though. It had clearly been dead for days and days. I gingerly dropped it into a garbage bag using a pair of tongs and threw the lot in a dumpster. But I still couldn't spend more than a few seconds in the trailer without gagging, so I slept in the tent instead. Pitched it as close as I could without picking up that smell, but I had a bad feeling the whole time I set it up. Like I was being watched. By the time I was climbing inside, it was midnight and I was desperate to get to sleep and see the cold night turn to day. Barely an hour later and I had to climb back out of the tent because the trailer door was banging in the wind. Okay, I told myself as I shuffled over in my tidy whities. Arms wrapped around my chest for warmth. That's my own stupid fault for leaving it open. I closed it in a hurry and went back to the tent but stopped dead in my tracks when I saw the zipper was pulled shut. I hadn't left it like that. I didn't know what to do. My brain went in two directions at the same time. One said I was mistaken. I had closed the tent and just forgotten it. The other said something or someone had crawled inside and was waiting for me. It had set the whole thing up as a trap, and the best thing to do was to get in my car and drive until the sun rose. But I was already half cut and knew I shouldn't be driving. The skeptical half of my brain made an appealing case. The world isn't a nightmare, it said. It can look like one sometimes, but it isn't real. If you hear a bump in the night, you go looking and find it was all nothing and you take a deep breath, laugh at yourself for getting scared, and move on. Still, it took everything I had just to take a step towards the tent. And I shone my light at it hoping to see some sign of something in there. By the time my hand was on the zipper, I was shaking like a leaf and rethinking my ethical code of not driving drunk. But when emotions get that high it's like you run on autopilot. Must be a survival thing. I opened the flap without really telling myself to and then I was looking inside my tent and there was nothing there. I crawled inside quick as I could, pulled the zipper back the other way, and tried to go to sleep. I settled down for maybe another 30 minutes when something's hand pressed against the tent wall, and that was when I started screaming. The way it came at me. Palm open, fingers spread, tent fabric stretching to near breaking point. Makes my skin crawl just to remember it. Long fingers that tapered to a point. Almost razor sharp. And a palm not much larger than a golf ball, even if the fingers spanned a dinner plate. In the nightmare reality of the moment I saw it the way I might see a spider. Equal parts disgust and terror. I had to get away, and I backed up so fast I wound up rolling the whole tent like a hamster ball. Lost the zipper in the panic. Didn't find it again until the last scream finally left my lips and I was forced to catch my breath in the silence of an empty night, accepting that whatever was out there was either laughing its ass off at me or waiting patiently. Either way, I was at its mercy. Only thing I could do was collect myself and leave the damn tent. When I finally climbed free, there was no one waiting for me. Only a couple wet footprints going to the nearest pool. I considered pulling the tarpaulin back and looking, but I was already scared shitless and had no courage remaining. Instead, I ran into the trailer, slammed the door shut, barricaded it with every last piece of furniture that wasn't bolted to the floor, and fell asleep with the smell of rotten meat filling my lungs. Come morning, I was thankful for the sunlight and the feeling that last night's events were just a dream. After that, I locked my trailer door every night, and I never slept in that tent again. No more possums, but it isn't uncommon for me to find scratches and dents in my door each morning. Nothing serious, but looks to me like the probing of a curious animal. Couple days later, something locked me in the boys' bathroom near the east end of the park. I'd only gone in 'cause one of the faucets was running. I just turned it off when the door slammed shut, and I couldn't get it open again. Had to kick the lock out, which isn't an easy thing to do. First kick, I nearly broke my ankle. Second time hurt just as bad, and I had to take a breather to cope with the pain. Found myself pacing and occasionally stopping to listen for any sign of someone waiting for me outside. Someone I could shout at, blame it all on. Anything to keep the anger churning and not let it turn to fear. It was a full hour before I got panicked enough to give it my all and finally broke the lock. Burst into the cold air all red-faced and flustered and found the park silent as a graveyard. Just those tarpaulins waving gently in the breeze. I learned some important lessons that winter. If you feel watched, feel like you're walking into a situation someone planned, it's because you are. When the park reopened, I was out of there without a moment's hesitation. Finally got that job on a construction site, and it lasted all of 3 weeks before I hurt my back again. Spent the rest of the summer laid up on my dad's sofa drinking and watching daytime TV. Got a call off the manager around August, and he told me it had been a bad summer. Not only had the cops been sniffing around like crazy 'cause some poor kid went missing in the area, but they'd had twice as many injuries as before. Said he just spent the day in court hearing testimony from the parents of some kid who never walk or feed himself again after he hit his head on one of the rides. He sounded pretty beat up about it. He wasn't the best boss, but it wasn't like we worked for Mr. Burns either. Poor guy was way out of his depth. Anyway, part of the court settlement was he had to have staff members on site 24/7. I'd done it twice before, and he was desperately in need of someone who knew the job. I nearly said no, but he told me it was me or some 17-year-old lifeguard who'd shown interest in the job, and I didn't like the thought of that. God help me, I accepted, and when I went back that third time I took a gun. And this time I trusted my instincts. If I walked past the changing stall and heard the shower running, I let it run. Hour later, it'd be turned off again. If I saw someone had left the lights on in the staff room, I let them stay on until morning when I could deal with it in the comfort of daylight. Flushing toilets. Wet footprints. Open doors. I learned to stop sweating the little things, and 9 times out of 10, they went away on their own. Pretty soon I found myself laughing at them. A big fat wallet sitting in the middle of a solitary lounger that had been dragged into the moonlight. A phone ringing from somewhere in the depths of a maintenance hatch. Those kinds of crude tricks weren't going to work on me, I decided. Thought I had it all figured out and there was nothing left for that place to show me, and then the park ate a drifter. Or something did, anyway. Did it right in front of me too. I'd found the guy sleeping in one of the brick-and-mortar bathrooms. We gotta keep those things warm enough to stop the pipes bursting, so I guess they make decent enough shelter. He was an agitated old fuck. Called me all sorts as I told him to clear off. He didn't make for the main exit though. Wasn't like he parked a car in the lot, was it? Instead he just made a beeline for the nearby hills. No fences in that part of the park back then. Only open fields moving into woodland. His plan was to just walk into the wilderness in the middle of winter, and I wondered if I was actually marching some guy to a cold death. I remember looking at his shoes and seeing the backs of his heels exposed, and I realized I couldn't let him do that. Snow was due to fall that night, and I knew it was gonna get real bad out there. "Hey," I cried out while slowing to a stop. "Look man, it's late, I'm sure." My words died out. I didn't really know what to say when he turned to face me. He was angry and tired, and I knew he wasn't ever really gonna be thankful for some randomer's charity. But that didn't mean I shouldn't try. For a moment the only sound was the tarpaulin of the large pool to our right. Was just about to cough up some more words when his feet went sideways, his body rotated around his center of mass, and the next part of him to touch solid ground was his head. It made a noise that makes my teeth ache just to think about. A percussive, almost musical note that really shouldn't be made by a human skull. The blood that sprayed across the tiles reminded me of when I'd go paintballing with my friends. I remember looking down at it and noticing a couple loose teeth. Strange feeling. For a few seconds everything turned to a kind of white noise as ancient instincts rooted me to the spot with fear. Paralyzed me. Million thoughts went through my head. The guy was dead. Something had taken him. That blood used to be inside of him. I have blood inside of me. Does my blood look like that? These thoughts were like the sparks that fly off a loose electrical wire. But I was stuck mired in them until the whistling in my ears faded and I heard something being dragged across the floor. The guy hadn't even gone that far. He'd flown about 8 feet and landed just on the edge of the pool. His legs were in the water, hidden behind the tarpaulin, and only his top half was on dry land. His head was a ruin of blood and matted hair, but he still managed to look at me for just a moment before he slid the rest of the way below the water with a quiet splunk. The realization he was alive kicked my ass into my gear, and I ran over to the circuit box and hit the button that pulls back the pool cover. Machine ran loud as it drew the blue heavy sheet back across the water. Felt like eternity waiting for it. When it was finally over and I could look down into the water and see clearly, there was no one there. Not even a cloud of blood polluting the pool. Nothing. I felt like I was going insane, and I even looked over and double-checked that the guy's plastic bag was still where he dropped it just so I could be sure I hadn't made the entire thing up. I really didn't know what to do. The only thing in that water were a couple leaves that had made it in their overfall, but that was it. And then I saw it. I can't explain it easily. It was a sudden overlap of realities, a bit like the hollow cube illusion where it can be two things at once. Without ever taking my eyes off it, that pool became every deep body of water I'd ever seen. All of them, all at once. It was every calm and glassy ocean surface with rays of diffuse light leading into unseen depths, every lake with murky kelp fingers reaching up out of the dark, every flooded basement with black and brackish water. I could smell the stagnant water, could feel the breeze you get standing on the coast, taste the salt. All of it at once. And something moved in those infinite waters, and it was big. It was like the first time I saw the Grand Canyon big. Like when you get on a plane and see the ground pull away so quickly it loses perspective. Whatever was down there was coming right at me, and I'm not ashamed to say I pissed my pants. An ocean full of stars was down there. And the thing swimming towards me had a body that obscured entire nebulae. I felt vertigo come over me, and I backed away and I slipped in the blood, and then I woke up a few hours later and started screaming. I had to clean up in the morning. And I had to pull the tarpaulin back across. Machine only goes one way, so I had to do it with a pool stick, and it made me feel sick just to go near it. Every time I got close I started to feel dizzy again. When I finally mustered the courage to look, there was the same old pool it had always been, but I'd never shake the feeling I had when I was looking down in it and saw teeth like tectonic plates. When summer rolled back round, I saw a bunch of kids in that pool and had to go be sick in a bush. The thought of them sharing space with that thing. Jesus. After that I felt like I belonged to the park, weird as it sounds. Manager didn't have to fight me to get me to stick around for a fourth winter, or a fifth or sixth. The rest of the world didn't feel so real to me anymore. Sitting and eating dinner with my father while he lectured me on my prospects. Getting a beer with an old friend who was passing through. I felt like I'd gone into fucking space and seen the world was flat, and now I had to just come on back and pretend like I cared about whether my soda was diet or not. Not long after that, the park had its last ever summer. It had gone too far by that point. Government was looking to close it all down on account of the accidents. And the manager was down the station every other day for questioning. 4 kids missing that year alone. I found one of them folded up inside a pool filter, but didn't report it on account of not wanting the attention. The rest I don't know about. I was told I'd be paid another month or so after closure until a demolition crew came in, but no one ever arrived. Just me, this place, and a back that's getting worse with each new winter. I don't patrol at night anymore. Little by little the park has become something unfamiliar to me. Grass growing up between old tiles. Pool water the color of cut grass and engine oil. Even in the day, you can see things moving around down there. And the smell of chlorine no longer fills the air. Now it's the heavy stench of rotten algae and dead water, and sometimes the tang of the salty ocean that I've learned to avoid like the plague. Makes me see stars in the corner of my vision, and I don't like it. My dreams are bad enough. Drowning in the dark, something huge bearing down on me. I've woken up more than a few times and vomited up salt water. I can't bring myself to think what any of it means because I just don't want to know. Last time I went in the park after dark I had a close call. Worst of my life. I've been thinking about leaving ever since, but I worry there's not much else out there for me at this stage. That, and I kind of feel guilty I didn't save all those kids with the cameras. Urban explorers they call themselves. And I say kids, but really they were college students who record videos for something called TikTok. Anyway, they came prepared. Scouted the park, even scouted me, working out my routine and where my trailer is so they could avoid my general line of sight. I had no clue they'd watch me for a whole day. Once they figured I was passed out or asleep, they drove their van as close to the fence they could find, climbed the top and hopped on over. For about an hour they got what they wanted. I've watched the footage 100 times. Broken down toilets covered in graffiti. Smashed windows and broken glass covering the floor. Old pools full of ancient water covered in thick, brackish scum. You can hear the glee in their voices. That kind of urban decay was their bread and butter. And they were good at it too. They stayed quiet. Didn't shout or break anything. They just filmed. Wasn't until they decided to try rowing out to the castle that things took a turn. I came too late. What got me out of bed was a scream. Maybe a few of them. It was blurry and I came to around 3 a.m. and still a little tipsy, my head foaming at the edges with a half-remembered dream of a hollow world filled with water. As soon as I saw the van, I realized someone had gotten inside the park and I hadn't just been dreaming the sounds of splashing water and panicked. But by the time I went in there myself, the place was silent. I really didn't want to search it at night. I hadn't gone in there after dark for a few years and things had only gotten worse. Set something off inside me. A kind of spiritual Geiger counter is how I think of it. An intense primordial warning system that made the shadows around me look almost infinitely deep. More than that, I guess, it felt alien. Sounds stupid, but it really did feel like I wasn't on the same planet anymore. I don't know. That part might just be all in my head, but that's how it felt that night. I'd pushed myself just about as far as I was willing to go when I heard it. A rhythmic hollow knocking. It was coming from one of the largest pools in the park. A shallow, kid-friendly one we called the castle because it had a giant jungle gym in the center. A kind of spaghetti mess of platforms and climbing bars and slides that the kids loved. I followed the sound and saw a pile of rucksacks and even a large camera on the very edge of the pool, and there, just a couple meters away, was a rowboat. The idiots had brought it with them. Probably thought they were being smart by avoiding the water below. At least they tied it off so it was easy for me to pull back in. I gave it a cursory inspection, shivering at the mere thought of floating across that nightmare water in something so flimsy, and was ready to leave it until the morning when I heard a quiet splashing. Something had climbed out the water, and my heart dropped as I instinctively flicked the torchlight towards the sound of dripping water and saw a thin, shivering shape climb onto the lowest steps of the castle. It looked gray and sickly, and then it started whimpering, and I realized I was looking at a girl. College-aged, with stringy hair and an outfit that might have been colorful before she'd gone in the water, but now it was just the color of ash and moss. At a glance, she almost didn't look human anymore. She looked more like a starving animal, shell-shocked and shaking. I shouted out to her, but it was as if she couldn't hear me. She dragged herself up onto a dry platform and curled up in a ball in the far corner, knees pulled to her chest, and wide eyes locked into a 1,000-yard stare. And something was in that water. It came close to the surface, displacing small branches and causing the thick pond scum to bulge but never break. From the looks of things, it was circling the castle, and in some parts where the algae wasn't so thick I got the faintest glimpse of colorless scales the size of my hand and a thick, muscular trunk. Sometimes it seemed to bump up against the castle, like it knew the girl was nearby, but it didn't know how to get to her. The whole thing shook and she'd whimper extra loud, but she still didn't show any signs of becoming lucid. I'd be lying if I said I didn't think about leaving her until morning. She was unresponsive and looked like she was just gonna stay in the same place. Wouldn't it be better to just go get her when the sun was up? I thought. But that was a pretty fucked up thing to think. She wasn't safe there. I wasn't safe just standing in sight of the water, and she was on some old piece of plastic held together with rusting bolts. What if it collapsed? What if something came out of the water? God knows it could happen. Something had touched my tent all those years ago. Who's to say it wouldn't walk on out to take her? At some point I made the decision. Don't know exactly what did it, but I think it was the sounds she was making, that, and the knowledge she'd been in there. God knows what she'd seen. I had to have sympathy. She needed help and I was the only one around who could give it. So once something deep inside me clicked, I knew I had to move quickly before the fear started to fuck with my head. I grabbed the rope and began to pull the boat towards me. I wasn't sure what would happen. Half expected something to breach the water like a hungry shark and swallow the boat whole, but instead whatever was circling the castle just slunk into the depths and stayed out of sight. Somehow that was even worse, and I found myself scanning the water obsessively as I worked up the courage to get into the boat. I tried to keep the momentum though. I didn't let myself start thinking or doubting myself. I just climbed in awkwardly, 1 foot at a time, damn near shitting myself when the whole thing wobbled and I briefly felt like I was gonna lose my balance. But I managed it, and soon I was sitting down and using the oars to pull myself through the water. As I rowed, my brain moved along in different directions. Part of me was almost watching myself, like from above, and asking over and over, "What the fuck are you doing?" while another watched that water for the slightest sign of life. And a third part of my brain was watching me for signs I was gonna crumble from the adrenaline and ice-cold fear coursing through my veins. Each time the oars broke the water I kept waiting to see something coming after me, and I was about halfway there when I realized that if it was big enough it could just bowl the whole boat over like a shark knocking a surfer off his board. It was too far to turn back when I saw the water rise in the distance. Again, it didn't break the surface, but it came close and sent a couple waves rolling across the entire pool where they lapped against the distant edge. They made the whole boat rock side to side like it was just a bit of driftwood. When the bulge in the water appeared again, it was on the other side of the boat. And I made the terrible decision to stop rowing and look over the edge. There was no bottom to the pool, but whatever was down there wasn't swallowing continents any time soon at least. Hard to pin size down, but based on the steely blue fins that slid by close beneath me, that didn't really matter. It could eat me easy enough, and that was all that mattered. Hell, I wasn't even sure if it was a fish or a squid or something else entirely, but I was pretty sure it still had a mouth somewhere in that murk. It gave the boat a gentle knock. Nothing serious. Not enough to roll it, but enough to let me know it was interested in me. I decided I couldn't just stay there floating in one place forever. I had to move. I grabbed the oars and threw all caution to the wind. The sooner I got off that water, the better. Sure, I'd have to figure out how to get back, but that was a problem for later. Right there and then, all that mattered was the rising terror and disgust that took all my strength to keep from bubbling up into full-blown panic. As soon as the boat began to move, the creature slid out of view again. Didn't know if I ought to be relieved or even more afraid, but I took advantage of the lull in its activity to close the distance, and once close enough, I pulled the boat over to the same steps the girl had climbed. Once there, I secured it with a bit of the rope and hopped onto the first step. Cringing at the way the ice-cold water felt slick and slimy against my ankles, the girl flinched at my touch, but she didn't scream or pull away. I told her it'd be okay, or something like that. Tried my best to sound reassuring. Tried to let her know I was gonna get her somewhere safe. I managed to pull her to her feet when she finally turned and looked right past me. I barely existed to her at that moment. She only had eyes for the water behind me. Something about the look on her face gave me pause, though. She wasn't scanning for danger. She was looking right at something, and before I had a chance to look for myself, she started screaming. When I saw it, I wanted to scream too. I'd never seen anything like it. Or since. A head like seaweed. A face like a scallop. It watched us with an almost casual interest that frightened me more than any predatory scowl. The look of a child about to pull a spider's legs off. The thought of it still makes my skin crawl. It was so still, so alien, I couldn't help but pause and wonder if I was looking at something real or if it was just bad special effects. And yet the moment stretched on, until something in that unknowable mind made a decision and the creature disappeared back beneath the water. I made a decision too, and I dragged the young woman to the nearby boat where she started to fight me the moment she saw it. Can't say I blame her. Last time she was on it she nearly died, but there was no third option. It was stay and die or take our chances getting to safety. Unfortunately, we had barely gotten within a meter of the thing when the whole boat was blown sky high with tremendous force. For a few seconds I stood there dumbstruck, the girl crying, and water falling from the sky like a momentary rainstorm. When the boat finally returned to Earth, it was a couple 100 meters away and hit dry land with a great crash. My stomach sank. How the hell were we gonna get off the castle now? Not a moment later, and the entire structure began to shake. By now the girl was close to hysterics, and I wasn't far behind. I took her hand and began to look for some high ground as that thing began to shake and batter the flimsy plastic supports that held the platform up. We were forced to climb up towards the plastic roof of the tallest tower, which wasn't exactly all that high up, but it was the best we could do. The bars leading to it weren't easy to navigate, and at one point I slipped and fell backwards, striking my chin painfully and looking up to see the girl going ahead without me. For a moment I nearly gave up, but then there was the sound of something snapping and the entire castle began to slide on one side. I looked down and saw black water rising up to meet me. The thought of sinking into that filth ignited something inside me, and I scrambled up the last few rungs and perched on top of the smooth plastic cover of the castle's highest turret. It was barely large enough for us both to sit on, but it was all we had. Looking back, I can't help but laugh. I make it sound like a great tower, but it was barely 12 feet off the ground. As soon as I was up there looking down, water quickly bubbling towards us, I realized just how badly we were fucked. We delayed our inevitable death by mere seconds at most. By the time the bright red piece of plastic we clung to hit the water, the castle had broken apart, so all its little pieces went floating in different directions. Ours was the last to go in, and it went down beneath our collective weight until the water reached our waists. And then it came back up, buoyant and hollow. It was no boat, but it came damn close. "Paddle!" I cried at the girl, and she did. And we pulled ourselves through the water to the nearest edge. Pretty soon the makeshift raft bumped up against the tiled wall, and we were dragging ourselves up onto dry land where she rolled onto her back. I continued to crawl for another few meters until I felt like I was far away enough from the water. Only once I felt safe, I let myself collapse and lay crying and laughing for what felt like hours. But the girl only cried. At first a whimper, then a sob, and then a howl. A painful gut-wrenching scream that made my own joy wilt until I could do nothing except listen to the raw grief in her voice. When I sat up to see if she was okay, she was sitting upright and staring at the thing that was rising out of the water. Again, no malice. Not really. At least I don't think so. It'd be like looking for a recognizable expression on an oyster. But it did watch us calmly as it ate what I can only assume was one of her friends. A man, I think. Hard to remember details. He didn't cry, but he did look at us for help that we couldn't give. I'm not sure I could even tell you how it ate him, but it looked painful and slow. Reminiscent of a starfish, I think. At some point the girl passed out, and not long after so did I. I doubt she ever made a full recovery. The only thing she managed to say, even hours later after the paramedics had sedated her and I'd finished giving my less than truthful statement to police, were the words "the stars" over and over. I think a lot about how changed I was when I first looked down into that water and saw the abyss below, but that poor girl was actually in it. She'd swam in those waters. Submerged. I don't even know how she came back from an ocean that doesn't have a surface. But she did, and somehow I don't think she'll ever be the same. But it's got me thinking about myself. About what I've lost to it. Jesus Christ, I'll be 40 before I know it, and what then? Just gonna wait here forever and ever? There's a number on the back of my paychecks. And I want to try calling it to find out more. Like, what would they do if I tried going somewhere else? Would they let me? Because it's gone. The days of Ellen Ditzworth are gone. The days of a good back and strong legs are gone. The person I was before I saw that drifter die is gone. Yesterday is gone. The past is a shared hallucination. Only the present is real. I need to get out of here before I lose more of myself. I'm never gonna understand this place. I realize that now. I can only accept that it exists and try to move on, which I should have done the day I saw those stars. Because there is an abyss, and it doesn't flow through time like we do. Doesn't occupy space like we do. But it's there, and it's full of gods the way a koi pond is full of fish. And I'm worried the more I think about it, the worse the part gets, and the closer I get to falling into waters that have no up or down, and which never ever end. In my dreams I am choking in the acidic bile of a creature that swallowed me whole. I'm worried that if I stay here much longer, I'll forget how to wake up. The end. Thanks for watching.